Well, thank you very much. It's delightful to be here. And I'm talking about a topic that I actually did a PhD in. And my supervisor was somebody who didn't believe in a word I wrote. It was Peter Singer. But a good PhD supervisor doesn't try to change the opinions of their student. They try and make them argue it rigorously. And what I'm presenting today are the sort of arguments in the secular world that I have taken on from the philosophical literature to try and counter the rather trite views of euthanasia that we hear about. And I eventually wrote this into a book called Is Death Ever Preferable to Life? And I think the first thing we've got to look at is the definitions of euthanasia, because what we're actually talking about here is active euthanasia. It's death caused by direct action or deliberate inaction intended to cause death. That's the definition. The problem here is that a term known as passive euthanasia has been introduced, which is meant to encompass treatment withdrawal leading to death but without intention. And the idea of calling that a form of euthanasia is to show an inconsistency that if you accept treatment withdrawal of burdensome treatment when it can't possibly do any good, then that's a type of acceptance of euthanasia, and if you accept passive, you then should be consistent and accept active. And in fact, that's quite flawed, because withdrawing burdensome treatment is sometimes the role of someone who's preserving someone's quality of life until they die. If a treatment can't be effective then and it's got side effects, then there's no point in having it, because it just becomes a burden. So treatment withdrawal in a dying patient is not euthanasia unless you actually intend to cause someone's death. And it's usually removing a futile treatment that's causing symptoms that we're talking about, and you've got no intention of causing death at all. You've got an intention of a good life until the end. Now, there are difficulties with the idea of intention. How do you probe what someone's intention was? They could say one thing and mean another. Well, the fact is there are philosophers like Philippa Foot who have talked about intention by what she called the counterfactual test. If we withdrew a treatment, a ventilator or antibiotics or something from someone who was suffering because of them, and they didn't die, would we seek their death in another way? Well, if we intended to kill them, we would, but of course that's not what happens. So this confusion between a practice to balance the benefits of a treatment with its toxicity and trying to call that some sort of active euthanasia is muddying the debate here completely. And as I said, it's trying to suggest that you're inconsistent if you want to relieve the burden of a treatment on a patient, and indeed yet you don't support their active euthanasia. Now, what's this business of withdrawing treatment? Well, physicians are not obligated to provide treatments if they're ineffective. We've heard, Norman Swan does a lot of this stuff, that there are some treatments that have been going on for a long time that probably are not effective. For example, there's a lot of arthroscopies on knees and things that probably don't actually end up in doing any good at all. And of course, it's a burden to the healthcare system. So a physician that said, well, I'm not going to do it because it doesn't work, is allowed to do that. And in fact, when giving options to patients, the value of a treatment should actually be mentioned. Is it futile? Is it the very last gasp? And what are the alternatives they have to a good life? Sometimes fourth-line cancer therapy really has very little chance of working, and it would be far better if you concentrated on symptom control. And symptom control is never futile. It's only last-ditch attempts with toxic treatments that can be futile if their side effects are worse than any possible benefit. So that's what we're talking about here. And people have tried to quantitate futility. Most would agree that if a treatment has not worked in the last 100 cases that you've used it, then it's certainly got very little chance of working the next time. And there are confidence intervals around that. And there's several propositions for how you might go about assessing the futility of a treatment. A qualitative definition attributed to by Plato, if the treatment fails to release the patient from being preoccupied with the illness and incapable of achieving any other life goal, then it should be regarded as futile. I mean, there are many treatments if someone's dying that will not stop them dying. So you've got to balance them to say, are they going to be of any benefit at all? Or are you just doing them because they're there? So that's a confusion that's confusing the debate. But when I got into the issue of euthanasia, we asked the question, why do we value life? Well, in the Judeo-Christian view, it's easy. Life is valuable because it's given by God and it's valued by God. God valued and loved his creation, and we should value and love his creation. Another way of putting it was in the philosophical literature by Immanuel Kant, who was basically supporting the same point of view, and he said humans have intrinsic worth. He based it on the fact that they are rational beings to make moral decisions. Therefore, humans are ends, not means to an end. And is suicide or being killed consistent with being an end rather than a means? So that the death would be would be an end, and humans have more worth than that. What about death itself? Is there any definition of death that will help us in euthanasia? Well, I think one definition from the human point of view is death has to be irreversible. Now, unless there's the miraculous, I'm not talking about Christ rising from the cross, and I'm not talking about a theological debate here. I'm actually talking about the fact that we regard death as irreversible. That's why it's such a challenge to all of us that are alive to think about death, because there's an irreversibility. And in fact, we have actually changed our definition of death. In the old days, you were dead when your heart stopped. And the man in the street could actually tell when your heart stopped by feeling your pulse. But that was no longer good enough, and it didn't suit our purposes, and we developed a brain-centred view of death, that your brain had to stop. And the reason for that is when someone gets put on a ventilator, they can look as though they're still alive because they're pink and the circulation's going and so on. But if they're brain dead, so when ventilators come on, if they're brain dead, does that mean they're alive or not? So the ventilator, introduction to the ventilator said, well, a heart death, if we can support the heart to keep beating, does that mean someone's still alive if their brain was dead? And on the other hand, we had the need for organs for transplantation. And the way you transplant organs is you try and keep them perfused for as long as possible until they can be transplanted into another person. So the heart is important in that, but where do we take organs from? Well, we take organs from people who are irreversibly brain dead. So the definition of death was not something that was handed down. It changes depending on in this case, the march of medical science and the ability to support the circulation with ventilators and to support and to keep organs alive in someone's brain dead so that they could be used to save the life of another. And so what this demonstrates to us, and this is an interesting point really on a lot of debates, at both ends of life, is there is no biological point which has intrinsic moral significance. We ascribe a significance to something. When we use a definition of death, we're actually creating a definition of when you're dead. And I don't want to be sort of crude about this, but, you know, things like the fingernails keep lengthening well after the rest of someone's dead. Do you have to wait for all of that to stop to call someone dead, or is it something about the brain irreversibly ceasing to function that makes someone dead? So as we understand more about the human body, we have to have an acceptable idea of death. But does it have an intrinsic moral significance? Well, so far, it's the significance that we have defined it as. And it was interesting, when I was doing my PhD, we got a chance to talk to a sociologist who was visiting from the United States. And I'd just written the chapter on the definition of death, and so we had to present to her, and I presented all these things about when we did. And I actually said, let's get away from the idea that there's one point when you're dead, and let's talk about a hierarchy of organ deaths where, you know, the heart stops means something, the brain stops functioning means something, and you can decide for any individual what that all means. And I explained this to her, and she nodded wisely and said, "You've missed one." And she said, from the sociological, from society's point of view, you are dead when the doctor certifies you as dead. And I hadn't thought of that at all, you see. And she asked me then whether it was a tremendous, when I, you know, was the first time I ever had to certify anyone dead, was it a tremendously sort of uplifting experience? And I said, well, no, I was actually scared stiff I'd get it wrong. So you wait for a few minutes. Anyway, but there's other definitions of death that are based on what makes us human, a thing called personhood, where if we can't think about our future and reflect on our past, and we can't interact with anyone irreversibly, then maybe that's a definition as well. So there's a lot to think about in this debate. But the point of euthanasia comes back to a point of comparing life with death, so that someone who chooses to die is choosing death over life. And even in the philosophical literature, there's arguments that don't stand up in that area. And there's a philosopher called Philip Devine who wrote a book called The Ethics of Homicide. And he actually, can we have a couple of slides on? I didn't give you the... he actually wrote a section of that book called The Logical Opaqueness of Death. And he said, to make a balanced decision, he called it a rational decision, but it's actually a balanced decision, you've got to know about both sides of the decision. And you know life, but you don't know death. So how can you decide that death is better than life? He said, if you choose death, you're choosing it by faith, that there's something better out there, or you're choosing it by a gamble, that there's something, but you're not choosing it as a decision that you can have as a balanced decision. I know all about life, I know all about death, and I've chosen death. So he said, how can you possibly choose death over life? Now that's an argument in the philosophical literature. It's got nothing to do with theology or whatever, but it's an interesting argument because it's quite persuasive. Now, what euthanasia actually means, if you choose death, and it's always argued on the right to choose, our personal autonomy. Euthanasia means that we're putting personal autonomy ahead of life itself in what we value. But autonomy requires us to be alive. So how can we actually do that? How can we put our choices above life itself, particularly if we value life either because it's God-given or because we believe that life should be an end in itself. And what euthanasia is actually often asking us to do is to balance a life of poor quality with death, although death was the alternative to a life of poor quality. And in fact, it's not the case at all. The opposite to a life of poor quality is a life of good quality. And if you can improve the quality, you can remove the need to ask for death. The opposite of a painful existence is not death, it's a painless existence. And I use that example simply because chronic pain is often used as an excuse for telling people that surely you're compassionate enough to cause people to die. But it's not existence that is causing the need for choice, but pain. And so the answer to it is pain control, not euthanasia. So it's a rather trite argument. Because in my world, in cancer, pain is not the worst of symptoms. In fact, extreme fatigue is more draining on life than pain is, and even breathlessness can be extremely challenging symptom more than pain. We've got plenty of ways of dealing pain. But in the secular world, there are activities where we purposely experience pain to reach another goal. And I used to talk about this in the abstract once, and I used to use the example of a marathon. A marathon's 42.195 metres. I know that because I ran the Melbourne Marathon 2 weeks ago. And when you get to about the 35 kilometre mark, there's a phenomenon called hitting the wall. Now, I won't go into the physiology of hitting the wall, but essentially it hurts. The muscles hurt, the calf muscles, the thigh muscles, and yet you've still got about 7 k's to go. So you put up with pain because you want to conquer one of athletics challenges. And in this case, I wanted to run around the MCG and finish and have the thrill of that. But the point is, pain does not determine in our life whether we live or die, because we'll put up with pain. And often patients, when they're relieved of the physical burden of their lives, they get to talk about and think about other things. They concentrate on relationships. And they can have rich relationships, they can repair relationships. And sometimes people who, relieved of the burdens of the things they used to do for everyone, they concentrate on the spiritual, often for the first time. And they find that these things transcend pain. So it's not a particularly good argument to end someone's life because they have some pain, but introducing other things that make their life valuable is important. So I came to think about euthanasia and think about what is a rich life when we're talking about a poor life being one that should be euthanized. What is a rich life? Well, a rich life is a life that has many options. And a poor life is a life where you don't have many options, either due to illness or poverty or whatever. You can't make many choices and you're confined in your life. But even that wouldn't be a good argument for euthanasia because death forecloses all your options. And we, in the cancer area and in medicine in general, we've developed a specialty of palliative care that relieves suffering using options other than death, with about a 95% success rate. But the thing is, people don't always know all of their options for having something in their life that they value. So, in fact, part of palliative care is counselling people to find out when they can't do the life that they remember, is there still valuable things they can do? That takes time, it takes skill. It's not as easy as euthanizing someone, but it means that someone can spend the rest of their life doing things that they will value. I used to know a pastoral counsellor when I worked many years ago at Peter Mac, and she used to liken euthanasia to tearing the last page out of a novel. Which I know some people read novels from the back, shame on you, but the point is that there are valuable things written on that last page. There are valuable things like relationship things and spiritual things written on that last page. Don't give the last page away too easily. And living until we die does not deny death, but but it's about living life to the full. My favourite verse in the Bible is John 10:10. Christ came that they may have life and have it in all its abundance. And that means not that we're not going to die, but we're going to live every second until we do die. And I want to talk about one little case very briefly of a woman that changed my, not changed my ideas, but reinforced my ideas. It was a woman I was looking after. She was married with 3 teenage daughters. She was an assistant in a dress shop in the Mornington Peninsula, and she developed bowel cancer, and she came to see me initially when it had spread to her liver, and I gave her some chemotherapy. And much to our great joy, it worked for a while. It shrunk the thing. She was able to get back to looking after her family and also actually back to work. And she came back about 18 months later, and it had relapsed. And we gave her some experimental treatment. She responded to that. But about 6 months after that, so she'd had a couple of years, she came back and the disease had spread to her liver and her lungs. And she said to me, I know there's nothing more that can be done for me. I can't do anything for my family anymore. I've talked it over with them and I want to die. Don't you think it's reasonable? And I said, well, you know, it's illegal, but we're not going to hide behind that. I want to know why you want to die. And she said, well, there's nothing more I can do. Now, if you ask people's families whether because there's nothing more you can do, they actually want you to die, the answer is invariably no. They want to be with you. They value you for who you are, not for what you did with them. And some people don't find that out till the end of their life. Well, I want to tell you all now, you're valued for who you are by those around you. So don't give it away too easily. And I'm preaching now. So anyway, to cut a long story short, we had this discussion, but the other thing the woman was worried about is when the disease got into her lungs, she thought she was going to die a sort of respiratory death, and her father had died of lung cancer, and she watched him suffer because of this breathlessness, you see, and she said, so sorry, I want to end it now. So 2 things happened. Her youngest daughter, who had watched us get her mum back on her feet and back home twice before, was absolutely furious with us that we couldn't do it again and had given up. And she ranted and railed at the nursing staff and the medical staff, and she just couldn't accept the situation. So I told Mum that her daughter needed a little bit more time with her. And Mum realised that there was more for her to do. But I also told her that I could use medications that made sure that she would not suffer. I'd use a little bit of morphine to slow her breathing down and she wouldn't have that dreadful respiratory death. She withdrew her request for euthanasia. She spent 5 more days with her daughter, who calmed down completely and began to accept that what was happening, and she died a comfortable death. Now that's just a practical example of what we're talking about. But the thing is that in the current sort of political era, can we legislate for euthanasia? So what about if someone did have the rare case where a symptom was dreadful and just unmanageable? Is it reasonable to legislate even then? Well, we rarely legislate for the minority. I've said palliative care works 95% of the time if it could pose a threat to the majority. And the threat is that we live in an economically rationalist society where there are pressure on resources, and unfortunately there may also be pressure on elderly patients not to consume those resources. So I wouldn't like to have the majority subjected to that for the odd case that we may not be able to adequately control. And the final case I'll give you, because when I've talked to churches about this, they've always used a different example. They've said, you know, Mabel was the pillar of the church. She was the church organist and she did everything and so on. And now look at her, she's sitting in this nursing home, rocking away, not knowing anyone. Isn't that a case for ending her life? Well, I understand that her friends and family may find it difficult to see her like that, but what about if she was sitting there rocking and reliving over and over again the best moments of her life, or thinking about a relationship with God or whatever? What about if she was doing that just because she wasn't able to do all the things that she was able to do once? Does that mean she should die? And you see, that's one of the fallacies of the argument. So I'm going to stop there. And what I've tried to do is to bring the arguments back into the secular context, and I hope you'll find some of them useful in countering some of the more trite arguments we're hearing about the need for euthanasia.